So here's a question for you. So we talked about this last strategy, and we said, this is a fast growth company. Can you think of other companies that fit this model, this strategy?
I mean, I could think some ways that came. I know, like, just digital photography was the same thing. It just didn't exist, and then it existed, like, really in mass, and those companies were bought up really fast by big players. And most of them, they never made a dime. They lost tremendous amounts of money by buying them.
Yeah, and there are a lot of industries in fast, and one I came up with was Facebook, because they could have easily crashed if they'd missed the window, but they actually were able to get liquid and get some money even before going public. But they were very much on this path. They just, they were just something, growing it faster and bigger. 9 billion people on the planet as subscribers. There just wasn't a parallel. There was no question that it had value, so they didn't need to go public until they could get like the maximum valuation. And I think they did get the maximum valuation. And now, it's taken a while for them to be able to, work into it. So, are they making? I don't know, but I know that their stock turned around recently. Yeah, I think they hit a low point. They came up with a new strategy, or they had some new numbers that started to impress the investors. But what I really think it was is they really played the game perfectly. They maximized the value before they went out, and so they got the highest public offering. I mean, there's very little bargaining leverage on the consumer side when it comes to buying the stock. So if you can get the maximum price, and I was involved in a number of IPOs, initial public offerings for startups, and it was very common for the stock to shoot up the day that the stock was announced or released, and within a week it would, the price would crash. And that was just, you saw it almost every time. And there are people who build a business around that. They always get in with an account from the underwriter, where they actually get the cheap shares or the lowest cost. The consumer public has to pay the transaction costs by buying it at retail. They get it at wholesale. They get the early price, and you can't get the initial price either, because as soon as you could put in an order. Let's say Facebook was going to come out at $38. And you're there, when the offering's going to be announced, you put in your bid for $38, and it never gets filled. Why? Because all the preferred customers get in at 38. Everybody wants it. There's this unrealistic demand, this manufactured demand. The price shoots up, and so you buy in 2 seconds after it goes public, and you're still paying like $40, $45, $50, whatever it is for the shares, and a week later it tanks. So this is fairly common. But in the case of Facebook, they were able to maximize the value, get the stock out there, and then, they had a chance to absorb it. And how could they not? They're, one of the largest social networking, or they are the largest social networking platform on the planet. So, yeah. So they just have to figure out how they wanted to monetize it. All right. So let's talk about, another thing about legal strategy, and then we'll move on. So we talked about, those were largely business strategies, and those, and I tried to warn you in the beginning that a lot of what we're doing is applying legal knowledge to business strategy, but we're not going to ignore the legal aspects of it. And the question is, how does it work? The way the legal strategy works is in order to come up with a great legal strategy, it must follow a great business strategy. If the legal strategy is to invest in patents, but the business strategy, isn't going to use that technology at all, then you're really wasting money. So a great legal strategy has to follow the business strategy, and so this is how we do it. This is a simple tool that just says, and it looks at the 4 examples that we just talked about, and it says, all right, what was their business strategy? Well, the first one was to target customers, the second was target acquirers, the third was the fast track PR, and the fourth was to ride that technology wave and go public. What was the legal strategy that we would have or might have offered to help accelerate the growth of the company? So this is what we're trying to do. We're proactively looking at their business strategy and say, what's the legal strategy? So in the case of Waypoint Software, what was really important to them was having good customer contracts, because they didn't want they wanted that customer feedback. They wanted to be able to use it and be able to publicize it. And so their customer licenses, the early customers who signed up for the alpha and the beta, who were the 10 best in the industry, you had to get a contract, and of course I didn't represent them, but I'm quite sure that you had to get a contract where you had the right to publicize it, where you were going to give them a discount because your strategy was to take those 10 and leverage it. They didn't know they were going to get a buyout offer, but you wanted to take those 10 and leverage it by being able to sell to all of the other companies. Now they may have said, we'll give you the first 6 months advantage, or they may have offered them some kind of a deal. But those customer contracts were probably one of their most important things to spend time on.
Contracts, do you think since they originally, Waypoint received an investment, not really, was it an investment or was it just simply they got paid in advance and provided discounts? Which do you think would happen? So if I'm one of those companies and I want that software, would I just lay out $100,000 and say I want a discount for 2 years?
At that time, I think they probably funded the costs, and a lot of the deals that I've seen is they'll fund the cost, but they get to a license at a discounted price, so for a certain number of years, and they get maybe some other benefits, some exclusive in their market, or for 6 months or a year. So that get built into it. But those things are negotiable.
Sure.
Yeah. But that's the advantage, and that's where I'd probably spend my legal dollars, is getting those customer relationships well documented and something that's consistent. You don't want some of them running off, and you want to have all 10 of them, and you've got to treat them the same because they're gonna, or something similar, because they're gonna find out and they're not gonna be happy. So you want to make those 10 customers happy because that's your strategy. Similarly with the Baby Einstein, their distribution licensing, their contracts, that's probably where they gained most of their value, because they were those big strategic partners who were potential acquirers. They own the distribution market. I think one of their early on customers was the Baby Toys R Us, or whatever the company was at that time. It was a big retail outlet for children. And so those relationships are going to be key, and structuring them from both a business and a legal standpoint is really where you'd want to spend your time and dollars. In the case of the fast track PR, I told you about the stock liquidation. That was one of the trickiest parts, is getting out rather than just getting stock and being stuck with somebody else's paper. And the last one, Facebook, there are probably a number of legal issues around that one, but one of the ones, if you think about it, their strategy was really to build subscribers. If you saw the social networking movie, he was like adamant about not selling out or taking on investors until they got more subscribers, or try to commercialize the site. Daryl.
They had greatly exceeded the number of shareholders allowed by law. They were almost forced to become
public, yeah, because there's a limit of 500 before you become publicly traded, and they'd have to file a registration statement, and they really want an underwriter, so they were limited. And I think there were probably a lot of games around who got the stock, and whether it was owned by one or many people. And having been involved in some of those deals, particularly this stock liquidation one, I can tell you, on Wall Street, the trading desk, they find a lot of ways around those SEC rules.
You can have an LLC own each shareholder member of an LLC.
You can.
You can have a lot of other members under that LLC.
You can, except strictly speaking, unless that LLC itself qualifies, for its credit investor status, then they should look behind it. Whether they do look behind it, whether they really verify the accredited investor, a lot of that stuff never gets done. And sometimes they feel like, well, if it's a big venture capitalist, who's gonna care? Who's gonna really be hurt? But you never know. And so they don't follow those laws, but they did run up against that in Facebook. But the legal issue, I think, that was most important to them was probably their website terms, because if they didn't have the right to sell to their customers, commercialize to it, if their terms, if they had privacy that went too far one way or the other, they were going to have problems, getting the value out of this investment, getting the return for their investors. So their website terms were probably pretty important as they were growing that business. And other things, I just picked that up. Make sense? So this is the tool. This is the reason I spent the time on this is because this is really the tool that shows how we connect the legal strategy with the business strategy, and wanted you to be able to see that as we start talking about it in some of the other examples. This is the last thing I'll do quickly on the acquisition thing. This is another strategy tool, but when you're thinking about selling, you also have to be thinking about who would buy it. If you're trying to come up with a strategy, you can't do it in the abstract. Oh, I'm going to sell it to some big company or the top. So these are the typical types of buyers for a company. If you're starting to think about how you might sell it, you can sell it to your key employees, you can sell it to an existing partner, and a key employee might be somebody who works for the company, but they don't have an ownership interest. A partner already has stock or is going to help manage the company. You could look for a new partner, which would be somebody from the outside who wants to come in and own your business. It's unusual, but it does happen. Or you can look for an institutional buyer. An institutional buyer is one that they might be a private equity company. They go out there looking for companies to buy, or maybe a publicly traded company, or someone or a professional, investors that are looking for an acquisition to fill in their portfolio strategy. And lastly, there's a strategic buyer, someone who their products are aligned with yours, and they really need your technology, or they really need your position in the marketplace. And the strategic buyer is the one that usually values your company the most, because it will allow them to expand their business. It'll allow them either to sell more of their products into your distribution channel, or allow them to take your product and sell it into their distribution channel. And so they're able to leverage your resources, and they're willing to pay a premium to get it, because all they need to do is plug yours in. That's why, as we talked earlier, the more your company is aligned with your strategic buyer, the more easier it is to sell your company or to be saleable. So there are two criteria I think that are important, and I kind of made this up, but it kind of made sense to me, and be interested if you think otherwise. That if you work with a key employee, and particularly for a small company, where it might be a situation where a father wants to transfer the business to their son, that would be a key employee, and maybe they want to sell it outright, or maybe they want to sell it, or maybe they want to transfer it in their estate. But what they're doing is they're creating a succession plan, and that gives them a lot of control as they go through the process. They can spread it out a certain number of years, they can give a certain number of shares over time, and maybe the last portion after they die. And that way they still have control on how the business is run. They make sure the company stays on course. They make sure the employees are not laid off. You don't have a situation where somebody comes in, buys the company, sells off the assets for more money, and the company's dead, and they've shut down the factory. So you get more control with it, but usually get fewer dollars. So it's interesting. I thought it was interesting to show the inverse correlation between control and valuation. And so when you're thinking about which of these options you want to pursue, you also want to be thinking about which of the criteria is important to you. So, Michael, in your situation, control is a bigger issue, because it's not just about the value of it. And so, who might buy it, you want to be able to maintain the control. And so these are a couple of criteria, but these are the classic or the typical 5 different categories or types of buyers. And you can use this in trying to identify what your exit strategy will be, who might buy this thing, and then design the business to, in a way that meets that buyer in mind. In sales, they call this the customer avatar. So have you heard the concept of a customer avatar? Does that mean something? What does it mean?
Well, it's a defining defining the customer, a paradigm or
Exactly.
for the customer.
Exactly. It's actually, so what you do, an avatar is just a mythical image, but you actually have to have somebody that you're focusing on as a real customer. Ideally, it's modeled after your ideal customer, or it is your ideal customer, but you have that avatar in mind because you can't do a great job at designing your product without a specific customer in mind. If you try to design it for everybody, then it doesn't usually work as well for anyone. And so the idea of a customer avatar is that you can add more value to the product that you're creating, and you can be more successful at selling to that customer. So this is the same idea, is that by having the buyer of the company in mind, and you know what they look like, it's not just some amorphous, oh, whoever's going to buy this company, I'm going to build up the database because they'll love it. Well, they may love it or they may not, depending on what their strategic objectives are. If you have a real buyer in mind, a real name, a real prototype, a real idea, then you have a model that will allow you to grow the business in a way or in a direction that is most likely to maximize the value or the control or whatever your criteria is. Make sense? All right. So that's the backdrop for all of it. We spent a lot of time on that because it sets up this whole concept of what business strategy and the connection between business strategy and legal strategy, and try and give you some tangible examples of what we mean by creating strategies. Now we're going to move a little bit faster because we're going to cover a broader range of areas. So this is an exercise that's in the, and a lot of these exercises we probably won't spend time doing, but you can go back and do if you like. And this is if you're actually trying to develop your own strategies. So these are some of the questions you would answer, and you can write them in the handout. But it's like, what's your strategy for your saleable business? Hopefully you're thinking about that already. Who is your ideal buyer, and how would you prioritize potential buyers? So if you noticed in that column I left a blank there, so you could say, oh, my number one type of buyer is the key employee, or a strategic buyer, whichever you prefer. Good? Helpful? Have you ever seen this kind of stuff before?
I've seen it from websites. Anyway, what are the strategies for selling websites? How you building it with the intent of who's going to.
Yeah, the concept. Yeah. How about this idea of the control versus money? Yeah. Well, part of the idea of creating information products out of this is I think that we've come up with some concepts as we've gone through this going through the process of working with businesses to develop strategies, where we have some things that I think would be interesting if as we get the products out there in a bigger way. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, but a big part of selling the business is preparing in advance. These are really the 5 key areas that you need to work on. Managing and tracking your assets and liabilities, intellectual property, personnel, your contracts, and your basic records. That's what is a large focus of the due diligence process you go through with a buyer. So those are the key areas. We actually spent a long time going through this. We did an online program called Optimizing the Purchase and Sale of a Business. We did it a couple years ago, and we did about 30 hours of recording just to walk through, and it's a little long, but we've actually sold that as an online product. So if you're interested, let me know. And that's where you would want to spend some of your time. Okay, another famous quote. Your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning. Your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning. Who would have said that? Who had unhappy customers? Any guesses? You don't have to know these things. Yes, Bill Gates. Get it right. It's funny. That's pretty good. Did you know it, or just? But isn't that funny? Yeah. Okay. That's cool. All right. So what we want to do is make our customers happy, and that's the second strategy. So how do you do that? Here's a strategy for making your customers happy. Streamline the sales process. I worked with a company, Delphi Forums, and we were selling to media companies. We were selling to major newspaper publishers at the time. Hut, internet company. We were top 100 websites on the net. We were selling a product to create online message boards for Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of them were media, like Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, to give them, at the time, this whole idea of social networking didn't exist. There was no Facebook. So we created a sales process. We were building the message boards for them, selling them for $50,000, $100,000, whatever it was, and we ended up with this problem because every one of these big companies would have their legal department and they would want to negotiate these contracts. And it just slowed the process down. And the sales teams, they generally didn't understand concepts of intellectual property rights. They generally didn't understand concepts of indemnification. So they had a choice. They could just say, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me, or they had to negotiate them. And so this was a problem because we're a startup company, we need to go fast. So one of the things that we did was we created a contract that supported the business strategy. So we figured out what was, our business policies. And we developed a good first draft. It wasn't going to work for everybody, but it was going to solve 90% of the problems. And so here's a strategy for you in your business, which is how do you find a good first draft? And the way to do that is you want to find companies with similar business strategies. So you really need to know what your business strategy is, and you need to be good at understanding what other companies' business strategy is. And you can have two companies in the same business selling the same product with different strategies. And if they have different strategies, their legal strategy or their legal documentation is going to be different. I do a lot of forensics. When I look at a contract, I look at it and try and psychoanalyze what's their business strategy, and often what's the lawyer's demeanor, the lawyer's style. So these contracts are like, they have maps. You can read what's in them. But what you want to do is, and today it's easy to find sample agreements, but don't just grab the first agreement. You want to find an agreement that has a business strategy and a business model that's similar to yours, and ideally it's a leader in the industry. And if you do that, and you don't want to just have one, ideally you have 5 of them, because if you look at 5 of them, of the best ones that are similar business models, then you start to understand what are the key issues and the key terms, and you can use those to create a good first draft. What we did was we created a negotiation guide. And what a negotiation guide is takes, once you come up with that good first draft, you see certain provisions get negotiated all the time. It doesn't matter what way I wrote it, the indemnification agreement was going to be negotiated. Why? Because big companies who have bargaining leverage, what's their bargaining leverage? They have a lot of money, and if you want their money, that's their leverage. And in order to negotiate it, in order to get the contract signed, we had to negotiate it. So what we did was I sat it down with the VP of sales, and I said, okay, let's talk about, and it's hard to do on the first time, but after you've done the 10th or the 20th contract, you start to see some of the variations. You start to write some of the variations. You take those and you say, which ones, from a company business standpoint, what's our policy on indemnification? What's the ideal clause we'd like signed? And what's the backup that we're willing to consider, and under what conditions? If you document it and identify it, you can then give it to the sales team in a negotiation guide. And they don't have to come back to legal to do it. So the legal doesn't hold it up, the negotiation process doesn't slow it down, the sales team is empowered, you're accelerating the rate at which sales are being closed, and you've got a more successful business. Make sense? So standardize the terms, centralize them online. So today it's easier than ever before. You can have your contracts in the cloud, access them anywhere. In the old days, if you want to know what a sales contract was, you'd have to go around to every salesperson's desk and find it. And then if they were in different offices, you were really hopelessly lost at finding a contract, or in any way finding out, standardizing the process, if you can't keep them in one place. Today, a good thing to do, particularly when you start, and you can create legal systems the way you create accounting systems. So the first thing you do when you start a business with accounting is you go to the accountant and they say, here's a list of all the categories. I want you to keep the receipts in order of those categories. Because if you don't do it now, they're going to be all messed up and it's going to be really hard to sort out later. So put them into Quicken with these categories. You can do the same thing with the legal. You can start with the contracts, you can look at the provisions, you can put them on a spreadsheet, and you can track them, and you can document where the contract is, who approved it, what the approval process is. The more you create a management approval process and the more you track it, the more you can set business policy. Because what you'll find by the time you get to the 10th or the 20th, you'll say, hey, there are 2 versions of the indemnification that we're willing to accept, and under these conditions. And you can't get there until you start to track and monitor and see how they're come out and make a determination. You just may not know the answer going into it ahead of time. So a good example is a startup that went from 20 to 200 employees. I told the story of that. That was the Delphi forums. When I started, they were 20 people, and they were heading towards 200 when they crashed. Okay, next, what's your strategy? So we talked a lot about the business, the exit strategy. But in order to have a great legal strategy, you have to have a good business strategy. And so this is a basic tool. And as simple as this is, I shouldn't say most, a lot of companies I talk to, I say, what's your business model? What's your business strategy? Particularly first-time entrepreneurs, because they're excited about their product. But in order to have a good business strategy, there are 3 questions you have to be able to answer. What are you selling? Some people don't know. Service people often don't have a product. Who are you selling it to? Who's your ideal customer? And why should they buy it from you? You have to be able to answer those 3 questions. They're very simple, but they are really hard. I know in my own business, really hard to answer. Make sense? To have a great legal strategy, you have to have a good business strategy. And I added this other column, vision and goals, because in order to set your strategy should be aligned with your vision and goals. If you want to create a website for sustainable environmental practices, you have to have a vision of how this thing's going to be used. And you're driven by that, in embodying that vision. And without it, who knows where you end up? So that's the 4th thing that you need besides answering those 3 questions. Make sense? Questions? Keep moving. Okay, so what does a legal strategy look like? So here's an example. I use my own business for this. I said, okay, I'm going to take the law. I'm going to sell legal strategies. It's different than traditional legal services. What products am I selling? Well, I'm going to sell consulting services or coaching services. I'm also going to sell online courses. And maybe I'm going to have a membership site where you get some of my best forms and some of my best information. And who am I going to sell it to? Well, the consulting services, they can afford to pay more because those cost more. So I need a client who is beyond the startup because they don't have much money. Those tend to be the growth-oriented companies, the companies that have gotten beyond the feasibility stage, that are usually from ideally $1 million to $20 million in revenue. They may not have a lawyer that is advising them that might be against this crazy lawyer who's doing this business strategy, legal strategy thing. So I'm looking for those growth-oriented businesses that are willing to spend $5,000 to $10,000 to give them a strategy that will take them to the next level or accelerate the business strategy they have. That's one customer. Another is, but this knowledge that I have is really valuable and it can help a lot of people beyond those who can most afford to pay for it. And eventually, maybe that will be a revenue stream. It's hard to start a product online and, earn a living doing it. But you can create some online courses, particularly in the legal area. Some people have made millions of dollars doing online courses, but as you can tell by the turnout today, that this is not the thing that gets people to come off the beach. So you can create some online courses, and they could be, the customer would be for startup businesses, a lower price point, because once you create it, the marginal cost of reproducing it is very, very little or nothing. And so it becomes cost effective to offer it at a much lower price. And then maybe you can do a membership site, and it might be targeted at both the startup and the growth, depending on what the benefits are. Now, why would they buy it from me? Because they enjoy the information. No, content by itself doesn't sell. It has to fill a need. It has to be one of those must-haves. And the must-have is this realization that businesses today has changed, that business owners want to take charge of their legal affairs, that they can create value if they do, and that what we're offering that is hard to find elsewhere is this integration of business and legal concepts. For the online course, it's going to be a lower cost, and for the membership site, maybe we're giving some unlimited access to a better quality of forms than they can download on the internet. So those are some examples of why they might buy it. The vision is to really empower business owners in a new way. That's the goal that we're working on, is really democratizing the access to quality legal information and being able to thread that needle or provide that balance between the simple forms online that really don't fit and the more complex information that they might otherwise gather from the internet or the lawyer that really doesn't apply to their business. We're trying to find that middle ground, and it's done through strategy, that critical path to getting the answer they need for their business strategy or their legal strategy, is right in the middle. Yes, Bob. Yeah. Well, these are just examples of how we can monetize this new business model. So one of the things that we're thinking about, and there are lots of different information products you can create, but a membership site is just simply, a library of forms or content that you get access to for a year, and you continually upgrade and improve. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. Yeah. Okay, so this is the exercise. What's your vision and goal? What are you selling? Who's your ideal customer? And how can you make them happy? Good. Any questions about second strategy? These are all, the trouble is, everybody wants to know what the strategy is for customers. It depends on your business. The legal strategy has to follow the business strategy. And even preparing for this, I'm like, oh, we do a lot of these great different strategies. Which ones do I do? This is an overview. If you have a specific question, ask. But we're going to really just hit a lot of these items on a superficial level. This is what we try to go in deeper with the mastermind. We do go in deeper, and we go in whatever you want. But what we try to do in this session is just to give you an idea and give you some tools that will get you thinking about strategy that you can apply to your business. So another famous quote. I like to remind people that creativity isn't a spark, it's a slog. Every artist, inventor, designer, writer, or other creative in the world will talk about his work being an iterative experience. He'll start with one idea, shape it, move it, combine it, break it, begin anew, discover something within himself, see a new vision, go at it again, test it, share it, fix it, break it, hone it, hone it, hone it, hone it. This might sound like common sense, but it's not common practice. And that's why so many people are terribly uncreative. They're not willing to do the work that's required to create something that's beautiful, useful, desirable, celebrated. No masterpiece was shaped or written in a day. It's a long slog to get something right. This knowledge and willingness to iterate is what makes the world's most creative people so creative and successful. Good guess.
Another Steve Jobs.
I was thinking Steve Jobs too. It really reminds me of Steve Jobs. This one you probably won't get unless you follow the information products industry. This is Brendan Burchard. He wrote a book last year called The Charge, and he's one of these information product gurus who has, does $10 million a year selling information products. And he started, from nothing and grew the business fast. And he's one of the sort of leaders in terms of creating these, big product launches. But he also has this innovative and creative spirit to him. And the way he talks reminds me a lot of Steve Jobs. So I was hoping somebody would say Steve Jobs because I think it was a similar sort of mentality. Yes. Compulsive problem solver. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I'm not sure, whether it's the inventor or the entrepreneur, because it's that persistence to get it right. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that makes sense. You know, I can totally relate to it because that's the experience I've had the last 3 years. I started on this journey and I expected to just shift a little bit in my practice and, you know, I've got a business orientation, I would just, you know, sell more of it. And I found that I kept having to turn over these rocks over and over and over again to figure out where I was going, you know, to the point that, you know, I couldn't be where I was today, where I have a sense of confidence without necessarily a widespread audience. Why? Because I've gotten traction along the way. I've gotten individual clients or customers that have gone through these transformations or experiences that I had never seen before. And yet I'm still turning over those rocks to fine tune it to figure out how do I create a mass market or a mass message where other people can have that experience or embrace it. And this is where I'm at. So, next strategy, claim your IP. I said before, Michael Alexak, 80% of the value of the business is intangible capital. So if the average company, 80% is intangible, that's something we want to protect. A lot of that intangible capital is going to be intellectual property, but not just intellectual property. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but the standard types of intellectual property that you use are trademarks, copyrights, patents, and trade secrets, which is usually marked with confidential or proprietary. We talked about the notion of getting paid twice. So this is what I had just mentioned, but a lot of these intangible assets, in addition to the intellectual property, are things like blogs and websites. And of course the blogs are copyrighted, but it's the number of subscribers and the subscriber list and who has access to the list. And a lot of the rights, if you will, are contractual rights. And you want to think about a lot of this intellectual property and these rights as this massive bundle of rights that you can split up any way you want. And what you're doing is you're splitting it up in a way that will maximize their value. So this we've done for years with licensing. Licensing will sometimes license based on the state. If your business is selling in California and it's all foot traffic, then to give you an exclusive license would not maximize the value because you're not going to be selling in Massachusetts. So that's a good example of how you can maximize the value with traditional licensing. Today, there are a lot of different ways to do it. You can maximize it by channel. So if there are some channels that work in print and others that work online, those might be separate. If there are some companies that sell in the United States but they don't sell in Europe, those might be separate. So when you're looking at your bundle of rights, you want to think about creatively, how can I split them up in ways that allow me to maximize the value? And if you get into that mindset, it creates possibilities. Because people kind of get hung up on the 2 or 3 ways that have been done in the past, or they've seen in the past. So the 4 basic types of intellectual property are trademarks, copyrights, trademarks, and patents. As I said, it's a bundle of rights. Now, the other flip side of intellectual property rights is that other people own them. And you don't want to infringe them. You don't want to violate other people's rights. Why? Because it makes them mad and they're likely to take action. How many people remember Nabster? The music sharing site that came out, was featured in the social networking movie. And Nabster was famous for flaunting, if you will, copyright laws by making it easy for customers to share music without paying license fees or royalties. And of course, none of us would violate any copyright laws or share information that we didn't have, but it's easy to do with computers and the internet. It's easy to click on a picture and put it into your presentation. By the way, all my pictures come from the clip art from Microsoft's PowerPoint, which I would assume I have a license to because that's why they put them in presentations so that people can use them. So you don't want to infringe other people's copyrights or intellectual property rights. And it may not be you. It may be people in your organization. It may be people who are not in your organization that you hire as independent contractors. So what happens is if you run afoul, you run into trouble. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem today. There are there used to be enforcement agencies in the software industry, and there still are. You know, Microsoft and a lot of the big software companies, they got together and they created or supported these independent enforcement agencies that if someone started copying their software, all they needed was one unhappy employee in the company to tell on the company or to say, hey, they've copied Microsoft software without paying for it. And these enforcement agencies would come in and they would, you know, estimate the number of unlicensed copies, and they would charge some exorbitant amount, and they get hit up. I had clients with small companies, they got hit up with these $40,000, $50,000 bills or more, depending on how many potentially unlicensed copies and all the fees and the penalties. And they were so powerful, it was virtually hard to avoid paying their fees. So that's starting to happen in other areas. There are the patent trolls who are enforcing their patent rights. But then there's also companies like Getty Images that are enforcing the copyrights. And this is only going to get more and more of a problem. So you have to be careful about what information you use in your business, because while you want to protect your rights, it's just as important to avoid infringing others. So it brought me to creating the fundamental law of IP. If you didn't create it, you don't own it. So you have to check to see if anybody's using it. If it's a trademark, you can search on Google. You can search using the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. You can search with the Secretary of State in various states, but you want to look to see if somebody else is using it. Why create a problem you know you can avoid? Now, you can also do professional searches. Lawyers have access, and some of these professional services are probably online. Thompson & Thompson used to have one. It used to cost like $400, and they would give you this big book, and it used to be in paper, and they would search every database, every trade magazine, every, and they just had these, massive databases, and you get this comprehensive search, and then they'd send it back to the lawyer, and the lawyer would review it to see if there was a potential conflict. Today, they put it at least in a PDF. So you don't have to get all this big book of paper and look through it, and it's easy to share with both the client and other people. But you at least want to do, if you don't want to pay for a search or you're not ready to invest in the name, then you at least want to do a preliminary search to make sure that somebody doesn't send you a cease and desist letter, because that's one of those things. So a cease and desist letter is one of those letters, usually from a lawyer, that says, hey, you're using a mark it's similar to one that we have registered, and you're going to really be sorry if you don't stop using it. I'm paraphrasing a little. It's going to cost you money and time, and from a business standpoint, it's going to decelerate as opposed to accelerate the growth of your business. So doing a simple search up front, at least to head off some obvious people, particularly if it's a trademark of your competitor, that usually catches their attention pretty quickly. So you're trying to cooperate and collaborate with them, and what you were suggesting is
at the same time letting them know that they've stepped on our IP too.
Exactly. So what you were doing was setting the stage by letting them know you have counterclaims. They sent you a letter with their claims, and you're saying, okay, but we have counterclaims, so you're at least putting them on notice that they may not want to rush into court, and hey, it may be better for both of us for us to collaborate and to see if we can work something out. All right. So. How do you avoid infringement? Well, first of all, you have to understand that IP provides exclusive right of ownership in general. So you have three strategies to avoid it. One, you got to find an exception to that exclusive right of somebody else's right. Maybe it's in the public domain. Maybe there's fair use. Maybe it's something that the government has rights to, or the government created. So finding an exception is one exception to it. Let me just finish this. But the trouble with the exception is it's very narrow. Particularly fair use is very narrow. It really isn't valid for a commercial setting, and even in the educational setting where a teacher, continually photocopies a book and hands it out to their students, that's going to be a problem. So I wouldn't count on fair use or any narrow exception. You agree with that, Darryl? Yeah. Yeah, so it's very, very narrow, very limited what you can get away with. So your other choice is to get permission or to get a license. And it's not so hard as you think. A lot of times people say, oh, gosh, I don't own that, or I don't know it, I can't use it. Well, you say, well, did you call them? I go, no. Well, there are a lot of times people actually would be glad to give you permission to use it. Why? They would get attribution. So anytime there's something that you might need or want, you might think about what you can offer them to give them benefit. The same thing's true. We see this a lot of times. Clients who start new companies and they leave an old company and they have some non-competition or non-solicitation provisions that would prevent them, or they're not clear as to whether they can do it, and then the investors are all worried about whether or not they will be sued. And we say to them, well, let's solve the problem. Let's go to the old employer. Maybe there's something the new business is going to do that they want or need. So I learned this from an old salesperson. He took over a company once, and he said they had this customer that was totally pissed off because the product they'd sold them that didn't work, and they didn't know how to fix it. There was some bug in the software, and they bought this thing and they invested in it, and they tried to work with them, and they tried to work with them, and they tried to fix it, and it just wasn't working. And they couldn't fix it without replacing the whole thing. This guy comes in, takes over the company. He goes, what was going on was the engineers just didn't want to deal with it. They didn't know how to fix the problem. But by the more they ignored it, the more pissed off they was, and the guy was ready to file a lawsuit. He says, I went in there, I just said, agree to him, yep, you're right, yep. And then I sold him 10 new systems. Because, I could solve his problem by giving him a new system. And so by dealing with it on a proactive way. So asking for permission or a license is not always as hard as you think, but think about what you can do for them. And the last strategy is don't use it, because you don't own it. It goes back to the fundamental law. Make sense? Okay, so there are some other resources you might want to look at if you haven't been there before, but the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Copyright Office, the World Intellectual Property Organization is a good place to talk about intellectual property. There are lots and lots of sources on the internet just to get you started if you're new to it. If you're not, then this will seem pretty obvious. Google, and this is another program we're going to try and launch. I shouldn't say try. We're planning to launch in September called Maximizing IP, and we're going to go deeper. This will be an online 1-hour workshop where we try to hit the highlights, see what we can do. All right, the IP strategy. Yes?
Quick question. The World Intellectual Property Organization, as I understand it, trademarks, copyrights, particularly trademarks, do not extend globally. You have to apply for a trademark in every country. So if you have a trademark on something, some company in China or India could create a duplicate website, use your trademark, create a phishing scheme to try to capture your subscribers and members or things like that.
Yeah.
Does this organization address that global issue?
This organization provides information about different countries, so you can find what the laws are, but you're exactly right. Just because you protect it in one country, it may not be protected in other countries. So I would think of the strategy as 3 parts. There's the laws of the companies in which you're going to do business with. So you're going to be in the United States, you're going to be in Europe, and that you're willing to spend money to protect it in. Then there are countries that you're not willing to spend money to protect it in. And then the third category are the countries that whether you're willing to spend the money or not, they're not going to adhere to the law.
Well, the fourth realm is really the internet, which is not bounded by countries. If you're doing work on the internet, there's no
It's a good point. And so you see that, a lot with the European directive, the European Union. The internet is a challenge, but those laws are emerging where when you start doing business with that person, then you're doing business in that country. That's not always the case, but you're starting to see that pattern where that will start to be more closely defined as who has jurisdiction and when. And the fact that there are international organizations, and there are also international treaties. There's the Berne Convention and copyright law so the laws are somewhat, synchronized. And that, I think you'll see it, as we become more of the global marketplace, you'll see more unification. But until then, you have to be aware that not every country is the same, and you have to spend more money to protect it in those other countries. But the three strategies is then there's the third country, which there are countries that just won't adhere to the law even if you spend the money to protect it. And you have to have a strategy where you say, all right, knowing that somebody's going to steal it, am I okay with it? And you don't have to do, because now you have digital rights controls. So you may decide not to put it in an open format. You may put it in a encrypted or a controlled format where you're using digital rights management, where you're not relying on the law, you're relying on the technology. And they increasingly add to that. Agree with that, Vincent? I know you're up on a lot of those technologies too. All right, we'll keep going. Okay, so these are the exercises you can do later, but what intellectual property do you own? How's it protected? And do you have any IP that may put your company at risk? All right, famous quote. These famous quotes interesting? I only have a couple more. As we look into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. You notice one of the missions for my business, or the vision, is to empower business owners. So this resonated with me. Who said, as we look into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others? It's a technology leader. I'll give you a hint.
It's a what?
Technology leader. A leader in technology industries. Any guesses? It's a hard one, unless you know the quote.
Zuckerberg?
Good guess? Bill Gates. Bill Gates. Okay, so we want to build a team. What's our strategy for building a team? Now you notice, I'm talking about legal issues, but I'm applying them to business strategies. So most of these strategies are focused not on the typical things you'd hear a lawyer talk about. It's like, okay, I could talk about independent contractor agreements, but that's the tail wagging the dog. What we're trying to do here is say, what's your strategy? I want to build a team. What's the best way possible? What's my strategy for building a team? How can the legal knowledge support my business strategy? So one concept is this one of the E-Myth Revisited. You want to be working on your business, not in your business. How many people have read that book? Michael Gerber's, pretty popular. If you haven't read it, okay, we're going to take a break shortly. If you haven't read it, the E-Myth really makes the point that you really need to document your operations. You have to get out of this doing all the service. If you're the person who knows everything and is the one who does everything, then you're never going to be working on the business. You're going to be constantly just taking care of the customers. In order to leverage your own time, in order to grow the business, in order to make it self-managed, you have to step away from it in order to work on the business. And to do that, you need to do three things. You need to document, you need to standardize, and you need to automate. And my slides are out of order. But so documentation, standardization, and automation, that's what I coined the phrase, the optimization mantra. That in order to build your business, those are the three things that you want to be thinking about. And I didn't invent the three things. I did coin the phrase, but I got that from when I was working inside of a company. I was head of operations, and part of my job was to oversee systems administration. And that was their mantra. That was, I learned from the best, where they said, look, in order to run this company, keep the infrastructure going, we can't be, wasting time and effort. And every time we hired a new employee, they had we had a new laptop. They had to, put all the applications that company needed. They needed to then train the person on it. And there was a lot of repetitive. And in order to grow fast from 20 to 200, they needed to standardize, document it first, and standardize and then automate it. And the person who told me about this was a very sharp guy. He goes, look, I don't want to do anything twice. So anything I think I'm likely to have to do again, I document. And then after I've done it twice, I can start to standardize it. And at least enough where you can start to see the patterns. And then when if the volume justifies it, we can automate it. But he was constantly thinking about how do we optimize these processes. That's key to hiring. So what does it have to do with hiring? Well, if you want to hire, you need to take what's in your head, put it into a system, create systems and processes that can be standardized so that it's much easier to delegate, it's much easier to hire people who may be at a lower wage if the processes are simpler, more straightforward. I tested this out. My son always, when he was younger, he wanted to make some extra money and he wanted to work for me. And I wanted to have him scan in some of the documents that I didn't have a chance to do it. But when he would scan, he would do half of them, he wouldn't, staple it, he would, wouldn't put in the label. I could, and you got to the point where it's like, okay, well, I appreciate the help, but I have to go back and it's harder for me to fix it than it is for me to do it myself. So I came up with, I want to test this out. So I said, okay, I'm going to write down the process. And if I tried to teach him that, he was like, no, I don't want to hear it. I got other things to do. I couldn't tell him the steps. But I spent a day and I wrote, it was just like a short paragraph. Here's how you scan the file and then put it into the file cabinet and how to label it on the computer. And it was about 10, 15 steps. I gave it to him and immediately he got everything, and I never had to, explain anything, and the reliability was incredible. So it wasn't like he wasn't capable or wasn't willing to work hard. It was just, all those things aren't in his brain. He hasn't been doing it as long as I have. He's not going to remember it. So it was very powerful to me how well that worked. Small example. And other people had similar experiences? Documentation, standardization. All right, keep going. We're going to take a break. All right, let's take a break.